When the inspectors arrived, the lab smelled of burnt rubber and formaldehyde. It was early January 1942, Delaware, a gray winter morning outside, all condensation on the windows and hum inside. Fluorescent tubes buzzed. The metal benches gleamed with solvent stains. And at the far end of the room, on a small table under a single lamp, stood a glass jar filled with viscous amber liquid. On its label, written in clean black ink, "Not for government use." Jar. Edward Lawson stood beside it, coat rolled at the sleeves, fingertips stained pale yellow. He was 38, a chemist for DuPont, once a teacher, now a man who had stopped trusting rules. Behind him, the radio crackled out distant news from the Pacific, the fall of another island, the price of hesitation. He didn't turn it off. The inspectors from the Army Materials Division were already impatient. Two men in olive coats, stiff as if pressed straight from the depot. One of them, Captain Reeves, tapped the table with his pen. "Dr. Lawson, we've reviewed your reports. The bonding compound you're proposing, polymer-based resin with heat-cured crosslinks, it's unstable under moisture testing. Too volatile." Lawson kept his voice level. "Unstable in the lab. Stable in the air. There's a difference, Captain. Wood and aluminum expand differently. My compound moves with them, not against them. It doesn't break, it bends." The younger inspector, a chemist by training, frowned. "It bonds metal to wood. It bonds survival to the impossible," Lawson said. They didn't smile. Reeves flipped a page. "Your tests lack repeatability. No protocol certification. No official patent filing." Lawson exhaled. "Because no one wants to pay for what they don't understand." The captain scribbled something, closed his folder. "We can't authorize an unverified adhesive for military aircraft. Burn the sample and destroy the notes." "I'm sorry, Doctor." Lawson watched them walk out, boots on tile, door shutting with bureaucratic finality. The lab was silent again except for the faint ticking of the chemical clock on the wall. He stood for a long minute, hands still. In his diary later that night he would write, "They fear the unknown, but it is the only thing that moves the world forward. Steel wins wars, they say. They forget that steel itself was once an experiment." He didn't burn the sample. Instead, he turned off the main lights, pulled open the lower drawer of his workbench, and slid the jar inside, behind a stack of safety reports no one had read in years. The amber liquid caught the lamp's reflection, a small sun in a cold room. Outside, the factory whistle blew shift change. Inside, he leaned on the bench, rubbing his eyes. Every instinct told him this was the line between caution and courage. The formula, his unapproved polymer, was still unperfect. It foamed under pressure, smoked if overheated. But when cured properly, it fused wood and metal like bone and sinew. No rivets, no weight, no fracture lines. He'd seen it with his own eyes on test panels, wood that refused to split even when hammered flat. It was alive in its way, bending, healing, breathing with temperature. A thing both fragile and indestructible. His colleague, Mary Holcomb, stepped in from the adjoining lab, her hands in her coat pockets. "They didn't take it, did they?" Lawson shook his head. "Good," she said quietly. "They'll need it when the metal runs out." He almost laughed. "You think they'll come back?" "They always do," she said, and nodded toward the hidden drawer. "Just make sure it's still there when they do." When she left, he stood alone again. Snow drifted past the windows, slow and heavy. He switched off the radio, leaving only the hum of the ventilation fans. The air smelled faintly sweet now, the resin still curing somewhere deep in the jar. He thought of the letters from his brother, a pilot in the Army Air Corps. "We patch our planes with tape," the last one had said. "Sometimes we pray more glue than metal holds us together." Lawson reached for a clean page in his notebook. He wrote only one line. "If I cannot fight in the air, I will fight in the chemistry of wings." Then he closed the notebook, locked the drawer, and turned off the light. Years later, when auditors combed through the lab's archive, they would find no trace of the formula, only the entry in his diary, half faded, dated January 14, 1942. They would never know that the glass jar was still there, dust settling over it like secrecy made solid. And no one, not even Lawson, could have guessed that this hidden sample, this forbidden glue, would one day hold together the wings of planes flying above Europe, carrying men who never knew his name. That night, as the factory went dark, the faintest light still flickered from the bottom drawer. A quiet act of defiance, glowing like amber in the dark. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Summer, 1943, Northern England, where the air never quite lost its dampness. The hangars of RAF Buttonwood stretched like long grey ribs against the horizon, their corrugated walls sweating in the humid wind. Inside, the smell of acetone and hot metal clung to everything. The British called it the Wooden Wonder. The de Havilland Mosquito sat in the center of Hangar 4, its pale fuselage a strange contradiction, a bomber made almost entirely of wood. On its side, someone had chalked a single word, ghost. American engineers watched from behind a rope line as the ground crew ran tests. One of them, Lieutenant Mark Sloan from the U.S. Army Air Forces, leaned toward the nearest officer. "You're telling me that thing's made of plywood?" The British captain smirked. "Spruce and birch, sir. And glue." The Americans laughed, a sharp, skeptical chorus that echoed off the rafters. "Glue," one said. "That's not a bomber, that's a piece of furniture." But the laughter died when the Mosquito roared to life. The twin Merlins screamed, the air trembled, and the wooden aircraft lifted off the tarmac like a feather pulled upward by sound. Within seconds, it vanished into the mist, faster than any B-17 could dream. When it landed 20 minutes later, everyone was silent. The pilot, still grinning through the open cockpit, shouted down, "She outran 2 Messerschmitts last week." Sloan turned to the captain. "And the glue?" The Brit tapped his clipboard. "Stronger than rivets. Flexible in cold. Burns, yes, but doesn't crack. Saved half the weight. Saved half the war, if you ask me." In the mess hall that evening, the Americans argued over pints. "Glue and plywood," someone scoffed. "Next thing you know, they'll be flying paper planes." Sloan stirred his drink. "Still beat our fighters to the clouds," he said. Across the table, a civilian advisor from the U.S. Materials Division, a man with ink-stained fingers and a clipboard too clean, leaned in. "You know what's funny," he said. "That adhesive isn't British. The original compound came from a rejected American formula, something a DuPont chemist cooked up in Delaware. Didn't pass our tests." Sloan frowned. "You mean we had it and threw it away?" The advisor shrugged. "Too volatile," they said. "Too new. You know how procurement is." He lowered his voice. "Name was Lawson, I think. Edward Lawson. Some say he kept a sample for himself." For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, the Mosquito's engines coughed back to life for another test, and the walls rattled with sound. Sloan finally said, "If he's still got that stuff, he might be the only man who can teach our birds new tricks." The next day, under pale sun, a small delegation from the U.S. Army Air Forces met with de Havilland engineers. Notes were exchanged, sketches drawn on napkins. "It's not just the wood," one British chemist said, holding up a small vial of amber resin. "It's the bond. The glue is alive, it breathes with the grain." Later, back in their temporary office, Sloan wrote a memo to Washington. It began simply. "Recommend immediate investigation into polymer adhesives for airframe integration. British use demonstrates structural resilience beyond standard riveted construction." He paused, tapping the pen. Then added. "Possible contact, Dr. Edward Lawson, DuPont Laboratories, Delaware." That memo, stamped confidential and filed under experimental materials, would take 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. By then, the British Mosquitoes had flown more than 300 missions over Germany, low, fast, invisible to radar. One RAF mechanic, interviewed later, said it best: "It wasn't the metal birds that frightened the Germans most. It was the ones made of wood, because you couldn't hear them coming until it was too late." In a drafty office back in Delaware, Lawson had no idea his name was circulating again. He still came to work at dawn, still mixed his amber resin in silence, still wrote in his journal, "One day they will need what they refused." And now, without knowing it, the war was reaching for him, across an ocean, through layers of bureaucracy, through the hum of engines held together by a chemistry no one yet understood. By autumn, the memo would reach his superiors. And the same men who told him to destroy his work would come looking for it. Only this time, they wouldn't be asking permission. October 1943. Michigan. Shop number 12 never truly slept. The air was thick with sawdust, fuel, and metal filings. Fluorescent lights hummed above the endless skeletons of bombers, wings waiting for skin. Outside, the wind scraped snow across the concrete, but inside it was hotter than a foundry, machines breathing, steel hissing, men speaking in half-words to save time. Edward Lawson stepped through the side door with a duffel over his shoulder. No clearance badge. No permission. Inside the bag, 2 unmarked 5-gallon cans filled with a resin the government had ordered destroyed. A foreman named O'Hara met him by the press line, face drawn by fatigue and fear. "You sure about this, Doc?" Lawson's voice was calm. "If we don't fix those panels, someone dies at 30,000 feet. O'Hara exhaled smoke. "Fine. But if anyone asks, I've never seen you." They set up in Bay 6, where part of AB-24 wing lay stripped bare. The Standard Army adhesive sat on a nearby shelf, official, approved, and worthless. Lawson pried open one of his cans. Amber liquid caught the light like thick honey. The smell was strange, sweet under the sting of solvent. "What the hell is this stuff?" O'Hara muttered. "Insurance," Lawson said. "Mix slow. Vent the air. No open flame." For trusted men came to help, 2 riveters, a fitter, and a young mechanic with eyes too alert for his age. They brushed the compound along the ribs of the wing, thin even strokes. The resin clung to the aluminum as if it recognized it. Every move felt illegal, every sound too loud. When the first panel settled into place, Lawson checked the gauge. "Press at 80 psi for 1 hour. Then wait 12 more. "Wait?" the kid asked. "Patience," Lawson said. "That's how science works." They watched the hydraulic press descend, steel jaws closing over their secret like a prayer. For an hour they listened to the tick of a wall clock and the occasional cough. Lawson wrote the time on the jig in grease pencil, 0210. Dawn brought frost to the windows. The air smelled of metal and nerves. They released the clamps carefully, every hand ready for disappointment. The panel stayed firm. No air pockets, no lines of separation. Lawson ran his fingers along the seam. Smooth. Whole. Alive. They cut a small piece from the corner for testing, a ritual of proof. In another hangar, a technician set it in the tension rig. "Pull to failure," Lawson ordered. The machine strained. Pressure climbed. At the point where normal adhesive should have failed, the bond held. Then aluminum, not glue, split apart, bright and jagged. "Failure mode, substrate, not adhesive," the technician whispered. O'Hara grinned. "Well, I'll be damned." They didn't celebrate. Not out loud. The cans were sealed again, the brushes burned, the resin residue scrubbed from the floor. Every trace erased before sunrise. A week later, the test aircraft took off under clouded skies. One wing used the approved compound, the other Lawson's. At 32,000 feet the pilot hit a violent air pocket. The left panel, approved by every manual, peeled like paper. The right held firm. He landed pale and shaking. "Whatever that stuff was," he said, "it kept me alive." The official report came 2 days later. Unknown polymer, field application successful. No mention of names, only a number and a stamp, confidential. Lawson read it in silence, exhaustion washing over him like water. He'd broken every rule in the book, and saved a machine full of men he'd never meet. In his notebook, he wrote one word: survived. He almost smiled, until he noticed the shadows in the doorway. 2 men in gray suits waited, civilian clothes, military posture. "Dar. Lawson," one said softly, setting a folder on the table. "About your adhesive. We'd like to talk." The hum of the factory filled the silence that followed. Lawson looked down at his stained hands, at the faint line of resin still clinging to his skin. He knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be chemistry anymore. It would be politics. December 1943. Washington, D.C., the city of polished corridors and typewriter noise. The war machine here ran not on oil, but on paper. Stacks of memos moved faster than aircraft. Each had its own mission: to find someone to blame. One envelope, stamped urgent, government inquiry, left a desk in the War Department and began its quiet journey toward Delaware. To DuPont Laboratories, Wilmington. Are you aware of unapproved composite materials being used in U.S. military aircraft? By the time it arrived, the words had already done their damage. Inside DuPont's headquarters, lawyers frowned, whispered, and called meetings that smelled of ink and panic. Somewhere in Michigan, inspectors walked along production lines, tracing their fingers over wings that didn't match any known adhesive records. The joints were too clean. Too strong. And the drums that held the resin? Unmarked. Burnished blank. The first report to Washington called it material of unknown origin. A colonel drew a red line beneath the phrase and added a word in pencil: sabotage. At a meeting on Constitution Avenue, a military attorney leaned toward Lieutenant Colonel William Crawford. "If the compound isn't registered," he said, "then whoever made it violated federal code. Even if it works, it's sabotage by definition." Crawford didn't respond. He'd flown long before the war, before checklists and committees. "What if it saved the planes?" he asked quietly. "Then it's functional sabotage," the lawyer replied flatly. In the following days, the investigation deepened. Inspectors found test panels that refused to fail, even when struck with sledgehammers. Factory records listed the source as shop mix. An engineer, trying to help, wrote in his report, "experimental bonding techniques, possibly from Ohio." It was a deliberate lie, a small act of mercy to keep one man's name out of print. But Lawson's name surfaced anyway. Someone in procurement remembered a discarded formula. Someone else remembered the phrase, amber polymer. Within a week, the pattern was clear: unmarked cans, exceptional performance, and one chemist who had once been told to burn his work. DuPont summoned him to headquarters. The conference room was bright and cold, a flag behind every chair. 3 company officials, 2 military observers. No one smiled. "Dar. Lawson," the senior counsel began, "the government has questions about an adhesive found in several aircraft. Do you know anything about this compound?" Lawson said nothing at first. The silence was louder than truth. Finally, he said, "Yes. I made it." One of the officers closed his folder. "You admit to distributing untested material for military use?" "I admit to using something that worked," Lawson said evenly. "That's not the point," the lawyer snapped. "You ignored protocol." "I ignored failure," Lawson replied. The room chilled. They showed him photos, aircraft panels, production records, fingerprints of his creation. "Do you understand what this means?" an officer asked. "You've altered government property. You've compromised oversight." Lawson stared at the photographs. "I compromised nothing," he said. I corrected it. They moved him from one office to another, interviews, statements, corridors of men who had never smelled solvent in their lives. In one hallway, he crossed paths with Crawford. The colonel stopped him for just a moment. They're calling it sabotage, he said quietly. I'm calling it survival. But that won't help you in there. That evening, in a hotel near the river, Lawson read the summons ordering him to appear before a Federal Review Board. He set it beside his notebook and wrote one line. They will not ask if it held. They will ask why I dared to make it hold. Outside, snow fell soundlessly over the Capitol dome. Inside, the radiator hissed like a warning. He packed a single suit, one that still smelled faintly of resin. He knew what waited in Washington. They didn't want proof of success. They wanted confession. And in a city that worshipped paperwork more than progress, being right could still mean being ruined. February 20th, 1944, over Leipzig, the sky burned white with frost and gunfire. The air was full of noise, the kind that pressed against the ribs and stayed there. Inside beat 24 Liberty Bell, every vibration felt personal. Oil fumes, sweat, cold metal, the smell of a machine trying to survive itself. Bomb bay doors opening, the pilot said. His voice was even, but his knuckles were pale. Flak bloomed ahead, black flowers in a gray field. Steady, the navigator whispered, as if the plane could hear him. Then came the sound. Not an explosion, but a crack, like the sky snapping in two. A shell tore through the left wing, slicing between engine and panel. The aircraft rolled, engines screaming. Men hit their harnesses hard. Someone yelled, "We're done." The pilot wrestled with the controls. "Feather 2, he barked. The dead prop folded, the vibration didn't stop. The whole ship shuddered, metal howling, air leaking through unseen wounds. The co-pilot turned, eyes wide. "Do we jump?" "Negative," the pilot said, even though logic said otherwise. "Hold her steady." Below the wing, smoke curled, but the panel, somehow, held. A line of amber resin glistened under the frost. "What the hell's keeping it on?" the gunner muttered. No one answered. They just listened to the airframe groan like it was praying. They dropped their bombs blind through the smoke and turned for home. The flak followed, then the fighters. 3 o'clock high, someone shouted. Cannons flashed, tracers cut through the clouds, but the crippled bomber stayed aloft. Liberty Bell to base, the radio cracked. Left wing hit, still holding. Repeat, holding. The pilot didn't say it out loud, but he knew they were flying on luck, or something better. 2 hours later, they landed in England. The plane rolled to a stop, wheels sinking into frozen mud. When the crew stepped out, they didn't cheer. They just looked at the wing. The outer skin was blackened, warped, peppered with holes. Yet the main seam, the one that should have torn away, was whole. Maintenance crews swarmed it under floodlights. "It's glued," a mechanic said, tapping the joint. "But not any glue I've ever seen." He ran a knife along the seam. It didn't separate. It bent, flexed, then reformed. What in God's name is this stuff? Word spread. Other damaged aircraft came back from missions the same week, wings ripped, engines gone, but bonded sections intact. One report read, "Port panel destroyed. Starboard panel, unknown adhesive, unaffected." Another, "Wing joint endured direct hit. Pilot credits structural miracle." An Air Force major, reviewing the data, scribbled a note in the margin. "We don't know why this plane stayed in the air. Maybe luck. Maybe chemistry." He circled chemistry twice. In the debriefing tent, the Liberty Bell crew sat in silence. The pilot, still pale, said finally, "She shouldn't have flown. But she did." Then, after a long pause, "Maybe somebody built her to fight harder than we can." That night, a courier from the maintenance division typed a short report for Washington. Under the field-labeled material, he hesitated, then wrote. Unknown composite. Effective. He stared at the word before sending it. Effective. It felt wrong, too small. In a smoky office across the Atlantic, Colonel William Crawford read that same word the next morning. He tapped it with his pencil, thinking of the man the army was preparing to prosecute, the chemist whose name appeared only in whispers. Outside, the city woke to another gray morning. Clerks carried folders through hallways that smelled of dust and authority. None of them knew that in a hangar an ocean away, a thin amber line on a bomber's wing had quietly rewritten the limits of what a machine, and a man, could endure. The report was passed upward, stamped, filed, and forgotten by noon. But in one office, the colonel didn't close the folder. He left it open, the final word underlined. Effective. Because for once, the sky had proven it first. March 1944, Dayton, Ohio. The tribunal room smelled of paper, metal, and fear. There were no windows, just walls the color of caution and a table lined with men who measured truth by signatures. Fluorescent light flickered over evidence, 2 wing panels, a few metal samples, and a glass jar half filled with amber resin. Dr. Edward Lawson stood straight at the end of the table. His uniform wasn't military, but the posture was. Across from him sat Lieutenant Colonel William Crawford, a War Department lawyer, a procurement officer, and 2 engineers who didn't want to be there. The dictaphone on the side table clicked softly, the sound of history being written without knowing it. The lawyer spoke first. Dr. Lawson, do you admit to providing and applying an unapproved adhesive compound to aircraft under government contract? I do, Lawson replied. You understood that was a direct violation of Army specifications? I understood, Lawson said. But I also understood gravity doesn't care about paperwork. The lawyer blinked. You're not here to make philosophy. No, Lawson said quietly. I'm here because my chemistry worked. That line broke the stillness. Crawford leaned forward. Dr. Lawson, what exactly was in that jar? A modified phenolic polymer, Lawson said. Elastic under stress, stable under heat. In English, the lawyer said. Lawson hesitated, then replied, it's a bond that forgives. The stenographer looked up, as if unsure whether to record those words or leave them to air. Crawford nodded toward the evidence. Test it, he said. A technician stepped forward. He locked the first sample into the press and turned the crank. At 600 pounds of force, the standard adhesive cracked neatly, a quiet, obedient failure. Then the second sample went in. The dial climbed. 700, 800. The metal creaked. Instead of the bond breaking, the aluminum tore open, leaving the amber seam untouched. Substrate failure, the technician said, almost apologetic. The lawyer's jaw tightened. Performance is not the issue here. Lawson looked him straight in the eye. Then what is? That it worked? Before anyone could answer, a courier entered the room. He held a telegram with both hands, as if it might explode. Crawford took it, read, and went very still. From, 2nd Bombardment Wing. Subject, ACFT 312. Damage, direct hit left wing, all 28,000. Bonded segments intact. Crew returned base. Comment, survival credited to unknown composite. For several seconds, no one spoke. The hum of the lights filled the gap. The lawyer finally said, one lucky plane doesn't change protocol. Tell that to the men who came home, Crawford murmured. The procurement officer shuffled his papers, searching for something solid. Even if it worked, it's unauthorized. Liability, chain of command. Command means nothing, Lawson interrupted, if the men it commands are dead. That stopped them. Crawford leaned back, fingers steepled. You concealed the compound. Why? Because they would have buried it in paperwork, Lawson said. And with it, more pilots. The technician, still holding the torn metal sample, said softly, "Sir, I've never seen anything hold like this." Crawford stared at the silver edge where metal had failed and glue had not. "Neither have I." The lawyer cleared his throat, reading from his notes. "This tribunal may recommend prosecution or commendation. At present, both apply." A thin smile crossed Lawson's face. "Maybe that's the problem. You're trying to fit war into categories." The dictaphone kept turning, catching every breath. The men whispered among themselves, the sound was dry, nervous. Finally Crawford spoke again. "Dr. Lawson, if ordered, would you destroy all remaining samples?" "No," Lawson said. "I'd secure them, for the people who need them." Silence again. The attorney wrote something, then closed his file. "Very well. The tribunal will reconvene when higher command decides." But everyone in that room already knew, command wouldn't decide. Not soon. Lawson picked up his hat and nodded once. "Gentlemen," he said. "If I'm guilty, it's of not waiting for permission." He left the room before anyone could answer. Crawford stayed seated. He looked down at the telegram lying beside the amber-stained jar. A bomber, a crew, alive because one man broke a rule. "We have two options," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "To condemn a criminal, or to thank an inventor." No one replied. The dictaphone kept spinning, the last sound before the record ended. The hearing was suspended without verdict. But somewhere above Dayton, a cold March wind carried the faint smell of resin, the scent of defiance that had kept an airplane in the sky. August 1945. The radio crackled in the corner of the empty lab, murmuring words that hung in the air like smoke: Hiroshima, atomic, surrender. The voice faded beneath static, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The war was ending. But in this room, there was no cheering, no noise, just the smell of dust, alcohol, and the ghosts of experiments that no longer mattered. Dr. Edward Lawson sat at his bench, sleeves rolled to the elbows, staring at glass beakers that hadn't been used in months. The instruments, once bright with urgency, were now relics. On the table lay a letter with the official seal of the War Department. He had already read it twice, but he unfolded it again, his eyes tracing the lines he already knew by heart. Formula number 47 approved for civilian aviation use. Public acknowledgement not authorized. That was it. No thanks, no citation. Just bureaucracy distilled into ink. Lawson folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the last surviving jar of his resin, the illegal one that had held wings together over Europe. The label had faded to a brown ghost of handwriting. Outside, Wilmington celebrated. Car horns, distant shouts, a factory whistle that had once called men to war. Here, inside the lab, the noise reached him as a muffled echo of another world, a world that moved on without remembering. He stood and walked to the cabinet. The hinges creaked like something waking from sleep. Lawson slid the jar onto the back shelf, behind rows of unused flasks. His voice broke the silence. "They made stronger planes," he said quietly. "But not stronger people." A soft knock came at the door. Mary Holcomb, one of the last colleagues still around, stepped in. Her lab coat was spotless, her eyes tired. "They sent your notice?" she asked. Lawson nodded, tapping the folded paper. "They approved it, under a different name." Mary sighed, glancing at the dusty workbench. "They're already using your chemistry for plastics now. Paints, coatings, whatever sells. Someone in Baltimore filed a patent for it last month." "And my name?" he asked. "Not there." He didn't react. Just wiped a spot of dust from the table, a movement so small it felt like resistance. "You know," Mary said, "if it weren't for you, those bombers never would have made it back." "Maybe," Lawson murmured. "But they still dropped what they carried." The radio interrupted them, a deep, steady voice declaring victory. The sound bounced off the glassware, warping into an echo. "A new power has ended the conflict." Mary stared at the dials. They're calling it a miracle. He shook his head. They always do. Until someone has to explain it. She gave a sad smile. You should be proud. I am, Lawson said. Just not of what they think I did. He opened his notebook, the same one he'd carried during the hearings. The pages smelled faintly of chemicals and time. He wrote the date, paused, then drew a line through it. Nothing else followed. Minutes later, a knock echoed again, this time the building clerk, delivering another envelope. The paper was crisp, official, faceless. Lawson opened it slowly. Your expertise may be requested for post-war materials development. Reference, R47. No signature. Just a number. Mary tilted her head. They're calling it by your code now. They always were, he said, voice flat. They just didn't know it. He stared at the shelf, where the jar of resin caught the dim light like trapped honey. He thought about the night he'd made it, about fear, risk, and the strange courage that comes from knowing nobody will thank you. Outside, the factory whistle blew again, not for war, this time for shift's end. A different kind of silence settled over the lab, thicker, almost kind. Mary rose to leave. So what will you do now? Lawson smiled faintly. Probably what I've always done. Keep working on something they'll never understand until they need it. When she was gone, he locked the cabinet. The metal latch clicked shut like punctuation on an unwritten chapter. He sat, listening to the quiet hum of the building, a sound more honest than applause. History, he knew, would remember the bombs, the generals, the flags. Not the glue that held wings together, or the man who broke orders to make it. He looked at his hands, stained, calloused, steady, and whispered. History doesn't love those who win by disobedience. Then he turned off the light. The lab fell into darkness, except for the faint glow of the jar on the shelf, amber, patient, alive. California, 1952. The desert air still held the night's chill when the hangar doors opened. A pale stripe of light stretched over the runway, enough to reveal the silver body of AB-47 Stratojet. It looked like an arrow sharpened for a new kind of war, long wings, 6 engines, and a skin that caught the dawn like polished bone. On its nose, someone had chalked Flight 217. Technicians moved around it in silence, wrenches clinking softly. A tag dangled from one of the access panels, bonding, R47, Lawson Mod. The words meant nothing to most of the crew, but one engineer, Daniels, paused when he saw them. He had heard the story, a wartime chemist who'd broken rules and vanished into paperwork. The test pilot, Captain Whitaker, climbed the ladder and glanced at the tag. R47, he said. Lawson, that's the guy from those old reports. Daniels nodded. His resin. We refined it for jet temperatures. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. Still trusting glue to hold my wings. It's stronger than the metal, Daniels replied. The engine started with a slow rumble that built into a solid roar. Heat shimmered off the tarmac. Whitaker rolled forward, the aircraft gathering speed, and lifted cleanly into the sky. On the ground, Daniels and the others watched until the silver fuselage turned into a gleam among the clouds. Up there, the Stratojet sliced through the morning. At 30,000 feet, the pilot pushed the throttle, chasing the edge of sound. Air wrapped tight around the wings, a pressure that once tore rivets from metal. But the joints held. The resin flexed, breathed, and remembered its shape. Passing point 8, Whitaker reported. No vibration. Down below, the engineers followed the data lines from the strain gauges. One of them whispered, "She's holding." The graphs trembled, then leveled out. Every number meant one thing, the seam refused to break. Whitaker dived slightly, testing the stress. The frame groaned, but the structure stayed whole. He pulled out of the dive, laughing into the mic, "Feels like she's carved from one piece." Minutes later, the jet touched down. The parachute blossomed, slowing the machine into a long, steady roll. When the dust settled, the crew surrounded the aircraft like priests after a miracle. Daniels ran his hand along the wing. The bonded panels looked untouched, smooth as poured glass. He handed a flashlight to Whitaker. This section took the heaviest load. They examined the resin line, no cracks, no widening. It had taken a storm of pressure and never flinched. The base commander, Colonel Ames, arrived as they finished the inspection. He was a veteran of the old war, his ribbons faded but his eyes still sharp. "So," he said, scanning the report, "this is the Lawson bond." "Yes, sir," Daniels answered. Ames looked at the sky, then back at the wing. "We used to think strength meant steel. Now it's chemistry and courage." Later, in the hangar office, Daniels filled out the test log. Under Material, he typed, R47, Lawson modified. The clerk beside him frowned. "Lawson? Vendor name?" "Not exactly," Daniels said. "Just a man who built something that worked." The clerk shrugged and filed it away, the story reduced to a line of letters and numbers. Outside, Whitaker walked the quiet runway, helmet under his arm. The air still smelled of jet fuel and victory, though neither would last. He looked up at the empty sky and murmured, "Hell of a glue." In the distance, the hangar lights flickered off one by one. The aircraft stood alone, silver skin glowing faintly in the half-dark. Daniels stayed for a moment longer, hand on the cool metal. "He'll never know," he said softly. "But every time one of these birds comes back, it's him." He closed the inspection folder and set it on the pile marked archived. Somewhere, a typewriter clacked out a report that would never mention Lawson's name. But on the runway, the jet that bore his unseen signature waited for morning, wings steady, seams unbroken, carrying in silence the proof that rules could be broken for the right reasons. Delaware, 1967. Evening settled over a quiet town where the university clock tower struck 6, and the sound drifted through maple trees just starting to turn. In a narrow brick house near the campus, Dr. Edward Lawson sat at a wooden desk surrounded by yellowed papers, lab notebooks, and a single glass jar, its contents thick, amber, and older than most of his students. He had grown thinner with the years, his hands still steady but marked by the pale scars of chemicals. The room smelled faintly of varnish and dust. The radio hummed low, news about rockets, satellites, and the bright new world of space-age materials. Lawson listened without expression. Those words used to excite him. Now they only made him tired. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. When he opened the door, a young man stood there holding a folder to his chest. "Dr. Lawson. I'm Peter Hart, from the engineering department. I hope I'm not intruding." Lawson smiled faintly. "Come in. Intrusion's just a polite word for curiosity." Peter stepped inside, looking around at the shelves of old reports. "Professor Kellum said you might help me. I'm writing a paper on composite resins for spacecraft. I found your name attached to something called R47, but no one could tell me what it really was." Lawson poured 2 cups of tea. "Sit down, Mr. Hart. R47 was never supposed to have a story. Just a result." The student opened his folder. "They say it was revolutionary, a bonding agent that changed aviation. Some think you invented it." Lawson laughed quietly. "Some think right. Others filed the patents." Peter hesitated, then asked, "Why isn't your name on it?" "Because names weigh more than truth," Lawson said. He turned toward the shelf and brought down the jar. The resin glowed softly under the lamplight, dark gold with age. "This is what held wings together over Europe. They told me to destroy it. I didn't." Peter leaned forward. "It still looks alive." "It is," Lawson said. "A living mistake that worked." They sat for a while, surrounded by the hum of the old house. Peter's questions came cautiously, about strength, elasticity, the chemistry behind the impossible. Lawson answered simply, as if he were explaining weather instead of war. When did you know it would hold? Peter asked. The night we stopped asking for permission, Lawson said. And the morning a pilot came back who shouldn't have. Peter flipped through his notes, then looked up. I wanted to thank you. If our spacecraft project succeeds, part of this will be built from your work. Lawson gave a small smile. Then promise me one thing, when they tell you to follow the book, make sure the book deserves it. Peter pulled out a form. Would you sign here, as the original source? It's just for citation. Lawson took the pen slowly, reading the line where his name should go. His handwriting was careful, the ink a little shaky. Beneath his signature, he added a note, for flight that forgives. Peter looked at the words. That's beautiful, he said. It's the only way things survive, Lawson replied. As the light outside faded, the two stood at the door. The street smelled of rain and cut grass. You could have been famous, Peter said softly. You still could be. Lawson shook his head. Fame is just gravity for men who want to fall slower. He looked past the student, toward the university towers glowing against the sky. I only wanted to keep them flying. Peter nodded, unsure how to answer. If you had to name the ingredient that mattered most in your formula, he asked, what would it be? Lawson thought for a moment, then smiled. Stubbornness, he said. The kind that doesn't wash off. The student laughed, thanked him again, and disappeared down the street. Lawson watched until the figure turned the corner, then closed the door and returned to his desk. The room was dim except for the soft reflection of the jar's surface catching the lamplight. He placed it back on the shelf, right where it had sat for 25 years, and whispered, still holding. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the faint echo of a factory whistle from far away, a sound from another life. Lawson turned off the lamp. The darkness folded around him gently, like a closing notebook. His formula had once held airplanes in the sky. Now it held memories. And somewhere inside him, the same bond remained, the belief that truth, no matter how small, was worth breaking every rule to protect.